Every neighbor on that ridge thought she'd lost her mind. None of them came to check on her when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single night. But here's what nobody in Prospect, Colorado understood about Clara Dunning. She wasn't losing her mind. She was the only one paying attention. She wasn't losing her mind. She was the only one paying attention. But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you what the valley looked like when it was over. Because that's the part nobody wants to talk about. That's the part Prospect, Colorado buried right alongside the cattle. January of '84. The Sangre de Cristos standing white and silent against a sky so blue it looked fake, looked painted, looked like God was mocking every living thing beneath it. 14 homesteads spread across that eastern slope. 14 families who dragged lumber and hope up into those foothills and said, "This is where we make it." And after 3 days of the worst cold snap anyone in the territory had seen in 20 years, 11 of those homesteads were done. Just done. Frozen cattle stacked against fence lines like cordwood. Water troughs split clean in half. Root cellars that weren't deep enough. Hay stores that weren't full enough. Cabin walls that weren't thick enough. 11 families lost everything. But one ranch survived. One. And I'm not going to tell you which one yet. I'm not going to tell you how. Because the how is the part that matters. And you're not ready for it. Not until you understand who we're talking about. Not until you understand what she'd already lost before winter ever came. So let's go back. Spring of 1882, a full year and a half before that storm. Henry Dunning built his cabin with hand-squared logs and a stone chimney that drew so clean you could hear the fire whisper. 60 acres at the base of the Sangre de Cristos, a south-facing slope with good grass, and a creek that ran year-round from snowmelt. He was a careful man, a quiet man, the kind who measured twice and then measured again because he didn't trust the first two. He'd picked that land for a reason, the creek for the cattle, the timber for the cabin, the mountain at his back to break the north wind. Clara Dunning stood on that porch the day he finished the ridgepole and watched him climb down the ladder with sawdust in his hair and a grin she hadn't seen since Missouri. She was 32 then, wheat blonde hair pulled back in that low braided bun she always wore, a few loose wisps catching the wind at her temples, her pale gray-blue eyes narrowed against the spring light. The thin brass wedding band on her left hand caught the sun when she lifted her coffee cup, and Henry pointed at the chimney and said something she couldn't hear over the creek. That was the last spring. May of '83. The creek swelled with snowmelt, running fast and brown and angry over rocks that had been dry a week before. Henry's bay mare spooked at a snake, or a shadow, or nothing at all, because horses are horses and they don't owe you a reason. She threw him at the bank. His neck broke on a river stone the size of a Bible. Clara found him face down in 18 inches of water. Here's what nobody tells you about pulling a dead man from a creek. The water doesn't stop. The creek keeps moving. It doesn't care. It runs over your boots and around your knees, and it sounds exactly the same as it did yesterday when he was alive. And it will sound exactly the same tomorrow when you're standing on the porch, trying to remember why you came outside. The weight of him was wrong. Not heavier than she expected, different. A body without a man in it doesn't move the way you think it should. She got her arms under his chest and dragged him backward through the shallows and up onto the grass, and sat there with the water soaking through her dark brown canvas skirt, and the creek kept talking, and the mountains didn't say a damn thing. She buried him on the south slope, where the wildflowers came in first, dug the grave herself because the nearest neighbor was 4 miles east, and she wasn't going to leave him lying in the grass while she rode for help. That was May. By the following autumn, 18 months later, Clara Dunning was running 60 acres and 40 head of cattle alone. She'd learned to repair fence line by feel in the dark. She'd learned which cow was going to calve early by the way it stood apart from the herd at dusk. She'd reinforced the root cellar with river stones and packed the gaps with clay and straw until it held temperature like a vault. Her hands were rough as saddle leather. The faint freckles across the bridge of her nose had deepened from a full summer of labor, and her scuffed brown work boots were caked with mud so permanent it had become part of the leather. The town of Prospect watched all of this from a comfortable distance. The postmaster's wife, a woman named Delia Marsh, brought a pie out in July and stayed long enough to count the fence posts that needed replacing. She reported back to the ladies' auxiliary with a satisfied tone of someone confirming a diagnosis. Poor thing, won't last the winter. The consensus formed the way consensus always does in small towns, quietly, unanimously, and without anyone bothering to ask the subject. Clara heard it. She heard all of it. She bought flour at the general store, and the clerk's voice got soft and careful, like he was talking to someone sick. She nodded. She paid. She loaded the wagon and drove home with her shoulders squared and her chin slightly lifted, and her jaw set in that firm, rounded line that meant she was done listening. Late September. The aspens were going gold on the upper slopes, and Clara started doing something nobody understood. She began stacking hay bales against the exterior walls of her cabin. Dawn until her arms shook. Bale after bale, hauled from the barn on a handcart, stacked tight against the log walls, too deep and climbing higher every day. She worked in her faded rust-brown wool coat with her heavy leather gloves, and she didn't stop to explain herself to anyone, not once. Why? She remembered something her grandmother, a Norwegian woman who'd survived winters that would make Colorado look like a Sunday picnic, had told her once about insulation, about dead air between walls, about what keeps heat in and death out. However, Clara didn't share that with a soul. She just kept stacking. And Prospect noticed. Emmett Hadley noticed loudest. Stocky, barrel-chested, that sweat-stained cream-colored cattleman's hat with the braided leather band perched on his thinning, sandy blonde head like a crown he'd given himself. He rode past Clara's fence line with his brother in late September, and they didn't just smile. They laughed, openly, the way you laugh at something that isn't a threat to you, something beneath the effort of cruelty, but getting it anyway. Emmett leaned on the counter at the general store the next morning, thumbs hooked in his leather suspenders, that double chin jutting forward, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Dunning widow has lost her mind, stacking hay against her walls like a child building a fort. Someone ought to ride out there and tell that woman to sell before she embarrasses herself any worse." That's what he said, like he was doing her a favor by talking about her that way. Clara heard about it by sundown. She pulled on her work gloves the next morning and kept stacking. But here's the thing about working alone at the edge of what your body can handle. The ladder leaned against the cabin wall at a steep angle, and Clara was reaching higher than she should have, placing a bale on the top row, arms trembling, boots slipping on the rung. And then a hay bale knocked her off the ladder, and the man standing at her fence line was the last person she expected to need. The bale hit her square in the shoulder and took her off the ladder. She hit the ground hard enough to see white. Not stars. White. Like the whole world got erased for a second and then painted back in, one piece at a time. The barn rafters. The gray sky through the open loft door. The taste of dirt and blood where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek. And a voice she didn't recognize. "Don't move yet." Now here's the thing. The man walking along the creek toward Clara Dunning's fence line that morning wasn't looking for work. He wasn't looking for anything. That was the whole problem with Josiah Kane. He'd stopped looking for things about 6 years ago, and he hadn't started again. Let me tell you about him. Then I'll tell you what happened when she hit the ground. Josiah Kane, late 40s, tall, 6'1", broad through the shoulders and chest, the kind of frame built for swinging an axe or pulling a stuck calf, but stooped now, slightly, like a man who'd spent years ducking through door frames that weren't built for him, or ducking through grief. Same motion, really. His hair was dark brown, shot through with iron gray, longer than respectable, brushing the collar of a heavy charcoal wool coat, with a leather collar worn soft as skin. Deep-set gray eyes, a strong, broad nose, slightly flattened at the bridge, a salt and pepper beard trimmed close along a heavy square jaw, deep creases bracketing his mouth like parentheses around something he'd decided not to say. He carried a bedroll, a farrier's kit, and a handsaw with a dark walnut handle, well used, the teeth still sharp, because he maintained his tools even when he'd stopped maintaining himself. What he didn't carry was hope, hadn't packed any, wouldn't have known where to find it. 6 years earlier, in Cheyenne, a woman named Mary had coughed blood into a handkerchief and looked at him with an expression that wasn't fear. It was apology. Consumption took her in 11 weeks. Josiah sold the boarding house they'd run together, paid the doctor, paid the undertaker, and walked out of Cheyenne with everything he owned on his back. He'd worked ranches in Montana, fixed fences in Wyoming, shoed horses in mining camps where the men were meaner than the weather. 6 years of moving, 6 years of sleeping in barns and bunkhouses and under open sky, and the grief packed so deep inside his chest that he forgot it was there most days. Most days. However, there was a certain quality of light, late afternoon, gold going amber, the kind that turns ordinary dust into something holy. And when that light hit just right, he'd stop whatever he was doing and stand still and not know why his hands were shaking. He never talked about Mary. He never said her name, but he carried her the way he carried that saw, every single day. So when he came along the creek and saw a woman fall off a ladder, he didn't think. He dismounted. He walked to where Clara lay on her back in the dirt, the hay bale on her chest, and he said, "Don't move yet." And he offered his hand. Clara refused it. Of course she did. She pushed the bale off, sat up, tested her left ankle, and started to stand on her own. That's who she was. Wheat blonde hair coming loose from its braided bun, wisps at her temples catching the wind. Pale gray-blue eyes, sharp and unembarrassed. the thin brass wedding band on her left hand catching light as she braced against the ladder. But her ankle wouldn't hold. It buckled. Not broken, she'd know broken. Twisted, though, badly. And the ground was uneven, and the ladder was wrong, and she was going down again. She took his hand, 1 second, maybe 2, his rough palm against her work gloves, her weight shifting into his grip. Then she was standing, and he let go, and she let go, and neither of them said thank you or you're welcome, because those words would have meant acknowledging something neither was ready to name. A small moment, the kind you forget by evening, except they didn't forget it. That single point of contact changed the geometry of 2 lives, bent the trajectories just enough that everything after followed a different line. But neither of them knew that yet. Clara looked at the fallen bale, looked at the half-finished hay wall along the barn's north side, looked at this stranger with the saw and the stooped shoulders and the gray in his beard. She explained the hay. Her grandmother, Norwegian, old country woman who'd come to Minnesota in the 50s and built a house with walls packed in hay and turf, thick enough to hold heat through winters that killed the unprepared. Clara had grown up hearing those stories. Insulation, density, the science of survival dressed up as folklore. But here's why it mattered now. The winter of 1880. Some of you know it, the great die-up. Cattle froze standing in the fields, locked upright in ice like monuments to human arrogance. Families perished, whole homesteads went silent. The valley Clara lived in had lost 11 people that winter, and it wasn't even the worst one on record. Clara believed this winter would be worse. Not believed, knew. She'd been reading the signs the way her grandmother taught her. Elk moving to lower ground weeks earlier than normal. Caterpillar fur thicker than she'd ever seen. Dense, dark, the kind of coat that says something's coming, and it's coming hard. The birds were wrong. The light was wrong. Everything in the natural world was pulling its collar up and bracing. Now. 2 possibilities here, and I want you to sit with both of them before I tell you which one's true. Either Clara Dunning was right, and everyone else in that valley was a fool walking blind into a killing winter. Or she was a grieving widow, spiraling into obsession, burning through her dead husband's money on hay bales and firewood, losing her mind one paranoid afternoon at a time. The town had already decided which one. Emmett Hadley had already decided which one. Josiah Kane hadn't decided anything, but he looked at the fallen bale, and he picked it up. He just picked it up, walked it to the barn wall, and set it in place like it was the most natural thing in the world. That single action, that one unremarkable gesture, it separated him from every other person in the valley. Everyone else had laughed. Emmett Hadley, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, that sweat-stained cream cattleman's hat tilted back on his thinning, sandy blonde head, small, pale brown eyes full of satisfaction, had called her desperate, called her foolish, called her a woman who didn't know what she didn't know. Josiah picked up the bale. $1 a day and meals, that was the deal. He'd sleep in the barn. She didn't ask where he came from. He didn't ask why she was alone. Fair terms for 2 people who'd learned that questions were just doors to rooms you didn't want to enter. 3 weeks. That's how long it took. 3 weeks of dawn to dark labor. Clara on her wrapped ankle, directing and working beside him. The 2 of them lifting and stacking and reinforcing
until the hay walls rose thick along every exposed face of the barn. The structure itself, braced, cross-beamed, the old joints shimmed tight.
Firewood stockpiled in cords that went far beyond reasonable, far beyond what any sane person would need. Stacked so high, the pile cast its own shadow. The town noticed. The mockery intensified. However, and this is the turn, it wasn't aimed at just Clara anymore. Josiah had a share of it now. 2 fools instead of 1. Emmett Hadley, chest puffed out in his tan canvas coat with the brass buttons, told anyone who'd listen at the feed store that the widow had hired herself a vagrant and was wasting good money on nonsense. Emmett Hadley had a new name for Josiah now. He called him the widow's fool. But the hay walls were finished, the barn was reinforced, and the firewood pile was taller than a man. And Clara was watching the sky. October settled over the Sangre de Cristos like a held breath. And inside that silence, 2 people who had forgotten how to be anything but alone began to remember. It started with the cattle. Clara talked to them. Not the way most ranches talk to stock. Commands, curses, the sharp bark of authority. No, she talked to them like neighbors. The brindle heifer she called Margaret. The old steer with a torn ear was Dutch. The skittish roan that spooked at fence posts got the name Reverend, because, Clara said, he acted holy but couldn't be trusted. Josiah heard her through the barn wall one morning, her voice low and steady, telling Margaret that the grass in the south pasture was sweeter if she'd bother walking the extra 40 yards. He stood there with his handsaw, that dark walnut handle worn smooth from years of grip, and he didn't move, just listened. And something in his chest he'd kept nailed shut for 3 years cracked open about a 1/4 inch. He didn't say anything about it. That wasn't his way. But the carving started. Small things. A wooden elk no bigger than a thumb, left on the porch railing one morning before Clara woke. Then a tiny horse, its mane carved in fine lines with a knife tip. Then a bird, a meadowlark, wings half spread, balanced on a knot in the wood, so it looked ready to lift off. Clara found them one by one. She didn't ask where they came from. She knew. She lined them along the windowsill inside the cabin, and she didn't mention them, and Josiah didn't mention them. And every few days a new one appeared on the railing, like a sentence in a conversation neither of them was ready to have out loud. However, something else was happening too, something quieter and more dangerous than carved animals. Suppers got longer. The first week they'd eaten in near silence, the scrape of forks, the crack of the stove, maybe 6 words between them. By the second week, Clara asked about the valley. By the third, Josiah was telling her about the spring runoff patterns, the way the creek changed course in '78, the summer he'd lost 4 head to a mountain lion he never did find. But here's where everything shifted, and I need you to understand what it cost. One evening, the fire low, the dishes still on the table, the last copper light dying in the window, Josiah said her name. Mary. He said it the way you'd touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. His deep-set gray eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the wall, past the valley, past anything Clara could see. The creases bracketing his mouth deepened. His heavy, square jaw worked once, like he was chewing on the word before he let it go. Mary used to hum while she cooked, he said. She couldn't carry a tune worth a damn, but she hummed anyway. That was all. One sentence. But his hands, those broad, scarred hands, went flat on the table like he needed to hold himself to something solid. He hadn't said her name aloud in 3 years. 3 years of silence built like a wall, and he'd just pulled one brick out, and the whole thing was shaking. Clara didn't fill the space. She understood that impulse, the urge to comfort, to smooth it over, and she let it pass. She sat with him in it, because she knew what came next wasn't comfort. It was exchange. She told him about Henry, not the version she'd told the neighbors, not the clean version. Henry took ill. Henry passed in his sleep. The Lord called him home. She told Josiah the real one, the one she'd never given anyone. She told him about pulling Henry from the creek, how she'd found him face down in 2 feet of water on a Tuesday morning, his body already cold, and how she'd waded in and turned him over and dragged him to the bank by his collar. How heavy a man becomes when he's gone. How her hands couldn't stop shaking for 3 days after, and how she dug the grave herself because the ground was frozen and there was no one else, and it took her 2 full days with a pickaxe, and she broke the handle twice. She said it flat, no tears, her pale gray-blue eyes steady, her chin slightly lifted, the thin brass wedding band catching firelight on her left hand. Josiah didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say anything at all. He just looked at her, really looked, and she saw in his face that he understood the specific weight of what she'd just handed him. Not sympathy, recognition. 2 people who knew exactly what it meant to keep going when the reason for going was buried in the ground. Now here's what I need you to sit with. The porch, gold evening light, the sangre de Cristos going amber, and then rose, and then deep violet. Clara on the left side of the step, Josiah on the right, the handsaw leaning against the railing beside him. The silence between them was full, not the hollow silence of a man alone in a house too big for one person, not the brittle silence of a woman who'd taught herself that needing someone was weakness. This was different. This was 2 broken edges set beside each other, and somehow the shape between them fit. The narrator in me wants to tell you they reached for each other's hands. They didn't. They just sat there, and the silence was warm. But inside Clara, behind those high cheekbones, behind that firm jaw, behind the careful steadiness she'd built like armor, something was happening she didn't trust. She'd spent 2 years proving she needed no one. She'd run the ranch alone. She'd read the sky alone. She'd buried her husband alone, and survived a winter alone, and rebuilt a fence line alone, in spring mud up to her knees. She had made herself into someone who did not need. So what was this? This pull, this gravity, this feeling of leaning toward a man the way a fence post leans toward the earth. Not falling, not broken, just settling into something that had always been waiting underneath. She didn't trust it. She fought it. She told herself it was proximity, convenience, the simple animal fact of another warm body in a cold place. She told herself she'd trained this out of herself and she wasn't going back. But then came the moment, late light. Clara crossing the yard from the barn, a coil of rope over one shoulder, loose wisps of weak blonde hair catching gold at her temples. She looked up, and Josiah was standing on the porch, his dark brown hair streaked with iron gray brushing his collar, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, and the expression on his face stopped her mid-stride. It wasn't desire, it wasn't hunger, it was something worse. It was hope. the raw, terrified, half-buried hope of a man who'd decided he was done with hoping, and then couldn't stop himself. Clara saw it. He saw her see it. And for 3 full seconds, neither of them breathed. She kept walking. He looked away. The rope went on its hook. The evening came down. Meanwhile, and this is the part that should worry you, the elk were gone. Not thinning, gone. The high meadows Clara had watched all September were empty. The aspens had dropped their leaves 2 weeks early. And the sky, that sky she'd been reading like scripture since she was old enough to look up, had taken on a color she remembered, a flat, pewter heaviness she'd seen once before, in 1880, the year the cold came so fast it killed cattle standing up. The signs were accelerating. The creek was running lower than it should. The ground squirrels had vanished underground weeks ahead of schedule. Every animal on this mountain was screaming the same warning in a language only Clara could read. And the message was simple. Whatever you think you have time for, you don't. Neither of them spoke of it. But something had shifted between them, quiet as a door unlatching. And both of them knew that when the cold came, whatever happened next would happen to them together. Mid-November. The storm didn't arrive. It detonated. 40 degrees gone in 6 hours. The sky turned the color of iron, and then it closed like a fist. Now, most storms come at you like a warning. They build, they grumble, they give you time to button up and get inside. This one didn't extend that courtesy. This one woke up mean and stayed mean. The temperature was sitting at a reasonable 38 degrees at noon on a Tuesday, and by supper time it was 2 below zero and falling like it had somewhere worse to be. The wind came off the northern ridgeline, not in gusts, but in a single sustained scream, a sound that didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't breathe. Snow fell sideways, not drifting, driving, like someone had turned the whole sky on its side and shaken it. 4 feet in 2 days, then 6. Then the wind packed it against every wall, every fence, every door, until the drifts stood taller than a man on horseback. And here's the thing about a storm like that. You don't fight it. You don't outrun it. You endure it, or you don't. The wind isn't wind anymore. It's a living thing with teeth and intent. It finds the gap in your wall. It finds the crack under your door. It finds the place where your resolve is thinnest, and it leans against it, patient as death, until something gives. The valley learned that lesson fast. Emmett Hadley lost 200 head in the first week. 200. Cattle frozen standing up in open pasture because the man was too proud, too chest out and chin up and thumbs hooked in his suspenders, sure of himself, to build adequate shelter. His polished brown riding boots weren't so polished anymore when he was wading through chest-deep snow trying to find animals that were already gone. That sweat-stained, cream-colored cattleman's hat of his, the one he wore like a crown, got ripped off his head by a gust on the 3rd day, and he never found it. Good. The valley didn't need his swagger right then. It needed humility. However, Emmett Hadley had never carried that particular tool in his kit. But he wasn't the worst of it. Families in Prospect with single plank walls woke to ice on the inside of their windows. Not frost. Ice. Thick enough to scrape with a knife. The Jensen family, their stovepipe collapsed under the weight of snow on the roof sometime around the 5th night. 2 adults gone to exposure before morning. found sitting upright at their kitchen table like they'd just decided to rest their eyes. The whole valley had spent months smirking at Clara Dunning and her hay walls, calling her foolish behind her back, and now that arrogance was curdling into something else entirely. Terror. Pure, white-knuckled, please God let this end, terror. But inside Clara's cabin, and this is where you need to pay attention, something different was happening. The hay walls held. Not just held, they performed. Those double thick bales, packed tight between the framing, absorbed the cold like a stone hearth absorbs heat, radiating warmth back into the room hour after hour. The interior temperature never dropped below 50 degrees. 50. While people a mile away were watching their breath freeze in their own kitchens, Clara Dunning's cabin sat like a warm fist in the middle of a frozen valley, doing exactly what her grandmother's voice had promised it would do. The cattle sheltered in the reinforced barn, eating stockpiled feed, their breath steaming, but their bodies warm. Every sack of grain, every extra bale, every cord of wood she'd split while Emmett Hadley was calling her crazy, all of it working, all of it holding. Vindication should taste sweet, but don't let that feeling settle in yet, because the storm wasn't finished, not even close. 11 days. That's how long they were trapped together, Clara and Josiah, inside those hay-insulated walls, with the wind howling like something wounded and furious outside. The world reduced to the size of a single room, a single stove, a single circle of firelight. 11 days is a long time to share a small space with someone you're pretending not to feel something for. The first 3 days were all logistics: feeding the stove, checking the barn, melting snow for water. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of two people who understood the weight of proximity. His heavy charcoal gray coat hung on the peg by the door. Her faded rust-brown wool coat hung beside it. Their boots, his tall black leather, hers scuffed brown lace-up, sat side by side near the stove to dry, and neither of them mentioned how domestic that looked. By the 5th day, the silences had changed texture. They weren't empty anymore. They were full, loaded with things neither of them was saying. Josiah would sit by the stove with his handsaw across his knees, working the dark walnut handle with a rag, and Clara would catch herself watching the way firelight moved across the deep creases bracketing his mouth. The salt and pepper beard kept short along his heavy, square jaw. She'd look away. He'd pretend he hadn't noticed her looking. The thin brass wedding band on her left hand caught the light every time she moved, and sometimes she turned it with her thumb, without realizing she was doing it. Then came the 7th night. The temperature dropped so low the trees cracked. You need to understand what that sounds like. It sounds like gunshots, like the bones of the world breaking. Cottonwoods along the creek splitting open with reports that echoed off the ridgeline, one after another, sharp and violent in the darkness. It is a sound that reaches into your chest and squeezes. Clara woke shaking, not from cold. The cabin was warm, the hay walls doing their quiet, faithful work. She was shaking from the sound, from the memory it carried, the memory of what cold can take from you, the memory of a husband who went out into weather like this and didn't come back. Her pale, gray-blue eyes were open in the darkness, and her breath was coming in short pulls, and the loose wisps of wheat-blonde hair at her temples were damp with sweat. Josiah was beside the stove, feeding it. His dark brown hair, streaked with iron gray, brushed his collar as he turned toward the sound of her breathing. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't say a word. He crossed the room, pulled a blanket from the chair, and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands were rough and deliberate. The small, dark birthmark on his right temple, near his hairline, was close enough for her to see in the stove light. She leaned into him, just slightly, just enough. He put his arm around her, slow, like he was afraid the weight of it might break something. They stayed like that until morning, until the gray light crept through the frosted window and found them still sitting together, her head against his broad shoulder, his deep-set gray eyes watching the last embers settle. Here's where I need you to stop and understand what actually happened on that seventh night. Because it wasn't the storm, it wasn't the hay, it wasn't survival. It was the pivot. The moment two people who had each decided, separately, firmly, with the quiet finality of grief, that they would be alone forever, chose, without a single word spoken between them, not to be. And the next morning, neither of them pretended it didn't happen. She didn't pull away and busy herself with chores. He didn't clear his throat and step outside. They sat in that gray dawn light and looked at each other, and whatever passed between them was honest and unadorned and braver than anything either of them had done in years. Braver than facing the storm, braver than preparing for it, braver than all of it. Because admitting you want to not be alone anymore, after you've built your whole life around the assumption that you will be, that's the hardest damn thing a person can do. When the sun finally broke through on the 12th morning, Clara Dunning stepped outside into a valley that looked like the end of the world. But her cabin was warm, her cattle were alive, and the man beside her had stayed. The storm broke in early December, and when the people of Prospect finally dug themselves out and looked around at what was left, they understood something that Clara Dunning had known since September. The valley looked like a graveyard for ambition. Fences snapped like matchsticks. Roofs caved under the weight of ice nobody bothered to prepare for. 3 homesteads east of the creek sat empty. Families just gone, packed what they could carry, and walked south before the second week was over. Nobody blamed them. Nobody could. But here's the number that mattered. Emmett Hadley lost 41% of his herd. 41%. The man with the biggest operation in the basin, the polished brown riding boots, the sweat-stained cream-colored cattleman's hat, the chest-out swagger. That man watched nearly half his cattle freeze in open pasture because he was too proud to listen to a woman who told him exactly what was coming. His prize bulls, his breeding stock, gone. Stiff in the snow like furniture somebody forgot to bring inside. And Clara Dunning's ranch? Every animal alive, every wall standing. The cabin warm enough that frost never once formed on the inside of the windows. The hay walls did exactly what her grandmother said they would. Exactly. Not mostly, not almost. Exactly. Now, here's where you find out who a person really is. Because the same folks who laughed, the same neighbors who watched Emmett Hadley smirk at her gate and call her operation a joke, who turned their faces away when she needed a single hand with fence posts, those people came to her door in January, hats in hand, eyes on their boots, asking for feed, asking how she'd insulated the barn, asking if she had hay to spare because their animals were starving and the nearest supply was 60 miles south through roads that didn't exist anymore. Clara could have shut that door. She'd earned the right. Every single person in that valley had watched her struggle alone and decided it wasn't their problem. She could have let them feel what she felt, that cold understanding that nobody is coming to help you, that you are on your own, that the world will let you drown and call it your own fault for swimming. She didn't. She opened her stores, shared hay from the reserves she'd spent all summer cutting alone, showed 2 families the exact method her grandmother had described, the stacking pattern, the compression technique, the air gaps that trapped warmth. Josiah Kane, his dark brown hair streaked with iron gray brushing his collar, his heavy charcoal gray coat dusted with sawdust, helped 3 families repair their homes. He carried that handsaw with the dark walnut handle from cabin to cabin, like a country doctor making rounds. Didn't say much, didn't need to. The narrator wants to say something here, and it's simple. Clara could have let them suffer the way they let her suffer. She chose differently. That's the difference between strength and cruelty. Cruel people think they're the same thing. They're not even close. Late January. A horse appeared at Clara's gate. Emmett Hadley sat on it. Alone. No foreman beside him. No audience. Just a stocky, barrel-chested man with thinning, sandy blonde hair going gray, combed straight back from a receding hairline. His small, pale brown eyes fixed on the cabin he'd once dismissed as a dead woman's hobby. He sat there a long time, long enough that Clara noticed from the window and came to the porch, her faded rust-brown wool coat buttoned to the neck, the thin brass wedding band catching what little winter light there was. Then Emmett Hadley took off his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands, and he said 3 words. "I was wrong." That's it. No speech, no explanation, no qualifying it with excuses about how the storm was unprecedented or how nobody could have predicted it. Just those 3 words from a man whose entire identity was built on never having to say them. Clara Dunning nodded once. Then she said, "Come in for coffee." Linger on that, because what you just watched is the simplest, hardest thing a proud man can do, and the rarest kind of grace. A woman who accepts it without making him crawl. She didn't rub it in, didn't remind him what he'd said at her gate, didn't quote his own ugly words back at him. She poured him coffee in a tin cup, and they sat at the table where Henry Dunning used to sit, and they talked about cattle losses like 2 ranchers. That's all. That's everything. However, there was still one thing Clara hadn't prepared for, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February, when Josiah Kane stood in her kitchen doorway with his coat buttoned and his saddlebag over one shoulder. "Spring work opening up further south," he said. "I should move on." The floor drops, doesn't it? After everything. After the hay and the storm and the 12 days of wind that should have killed them both. After he stayed when no one else would. He's leaving. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't cruelty. This was the last test, and Josiah was giving it to himself. Because a man who's been a drifter for 15 years doesn't know how to believe he's allowed to stop drifting. He was giving her the exit, giving himself the excuse. Too old at nearly 50, too worn out, too much gray in his beard, too many years of moving on to pretend he knew how to stay. Clara stood in that doorway, pale gray-blue eyes steady, the loose wisps of weak blonde hair at her temples not moving because there was no wind that morning, just stillness. She said nothing for a long moment, long enough that Josiah shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Then she said it. "You could stay." His objection came fast, rehearsed, the way a man argues with himself before he argues with anyone else. Too old, too beat up, too much of a drifter to be any good to anybody. Her answer was 5 words. "You're the only man who didn't laugh." That line broke everything open, because it was true. In a valley full of people who saw a widow with hay bales and decided she was foolish, Josiah Kane was the only one who walked up her road and asked what she needed. Not because he pitied her, because he recognized her. One stubborn person knows another. He stayed, not because she needed him. She'd proven to the entire valley she needed no one. He stayed because she chose him. And being chosen by Clara Dunning is not something a man walks away from. April of 1885. The wedding happened on the porch. Hay bales still stacked against the north wall because Clara saw no reason to take them down until she was sure winter was really done. Practical to the last. 3 families from Prospect attended. Emmett Hadley was not among them, but he sent a side of beef, which was its own kind of apology, the kind a man like that knows how to give. Josiah wore his heavy charcoal gray coat. Clara wore the cream-colored cotton blouse, clean for once, no dust on the sleeves. The thin brass wedding band moved to her right hand. A new one, plain iron, took its place on the left. The land tried to take everything from her. It took her husband. It took her peace. It took every comfortable assumption about neighbors and community and people doing right by each other. But it could not take her mind. It could not take her will. It could not take her grandmother's wisdom, carried across an ocean and planted in Wyoming soil like a seed that doesn't care whether you believe in it. And in the end, the land gave her back something she never asked for. A man who listened when everyone else laughed. The meadowlarks were calling from the fence posts, and on the mantel, beside the only photograph of Henry Dunning, sat a small carved wooden elk. Both things true at once, the grief and the new beginning, the way only a life lived honestly allows.